Hi, Jim Stroud here. Back in the day, the TV miniseries Roots was a cultural phenomenon. Roots followed the ancestral line of author Alex Haley. It was a remarkable work and shaped how many people viewed slavery in America. It certainly shaped mine. Until I discovered a very inconvenient truth. Actually, quite a few inconvenient truths. Take a good look at this guy and remember his face well, because he is the reason why black people were slaves in America. Let me start off by saying I am not a historian, nor do I play one on TV. But I certainly can read what other historians have researched. And here's a little something I learned recently from the Smithsonian. Way back in the day, the 1600s to be exact, the administrators of Virginia, Britain's first colony in the New World, offered land to any of their colonists who could bring more colonists over. Now, there were a lot of people who were willing to come to Virginia in spirit, but their wallet was weak. So Virginia got together with their marketing department and decided on the concept of indentured servitude. Oh, wait a second. Do you know what an indentured servant is? Yo, it's time for a tangent! Indentured servants first arrived in America in the decade following the settlement of Jamestown by the Virginia Company in 1607. The idea of indentured servitude was born of a need for cheap labor. The earliest settlers soon realized that they had lots of land to care for, but no one to care for it. With passage to the colonies expensive for all but the wealthy, the Virginia Company developed a system of indentured servitude to attract workers. Indentured servants became vital to the colonial economy. Typically, an indentured servant would come over to the United States and work anywhere from 4 to 7 years in exchange for room and board and a place to stay. Room and board and some money at the end of their servitude, called I think they called it freedom dues. Now, the life of an indentured servant was hard and very restrictive, but it was not slavery, for the simple fact that there were laws available, not a lot, but there were laws available that protected the rights of indentured servants. Now, if you were to break the covenant of the contract of the indentured servitude, like running away, or if you're a woman becoming pregnant, then your indentured servitude could be extended, right? For those that survived the work and received their freedom package, many historians argue that they were better off than those new immigrants who came freely to the country. Their contract may have included at least 25 acres of land, a year's worth of corn, arms, a cow, new clothes. Some servants did rise to become part of the colonial elite, the 1% of the day. But for the majority of indentured servants that survived a treacherous journey by sea and the harsh conditions of life in the New World, satisfaction was basically a modest life as a free man in a burgeoning colonial economy. In 1619, there were no laws about slavery. And also in 1619, the first Africans arrived in Virginia. And again, since there were no laws regarding slavery at that time, they were treated like indentured servants. And so they were treated the same way as white indentured servants of that time. It's important to note, though, that while you are an indentured servant, whether you were black or white, you were considered the property of the person who was sponsoring you until you worked off your contract. Tangent over! One of the Africans to arrive in Virginia in 1619 was an Angola native named Antonio, who would later rename himself Anthony Johnson. Now, what? Oh, how did Anthony Johnson get to Virginia in the first place? Well, you know what? Time for another tangent! Johnson was captured in his native Angola by an enemy tribe and sold to Arab slave traders. He was eventually sold as an indentured servant to a merchant working for the Virginia Company. Tangent over! By 1623, Anthony Johnson had worked out all of the parameters of his indenture and obtained his freedom. A few years later in his life, he became a successful tobacco planter and hired several white and African indentured servants. Wait. What? Yes, I'll say that again. By 1623, Anthony Johnson had worked off the period of his indenture, obtained his freedom, and a few years later, he was a successful tobacco farmer with white and African indentured servants working for him. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The African servant working for Johnson was called John Kazor. When John Kazor finished his 7-year contract of working as an indentured servant for Johnson, he said, okay, my time is up, I'm gone. But Anthony Johnson said, no, I'm going to renege on the contract, and I say that you must continue working for me. John Kazor did not appreciate that. He said, see ya, in his own way. And he went down the street, proverbially speaking, and started working for a guy named Robert Parker. Well, Anthony Johnson didn't appreciate that too much, so he sued Robert Parker for his property, John Kazor, and took him to court. And Anthony Johnson won. Check out this quote from the Northampton County Court. And it says here, this day, Anthony Johnson, Negro, made his complaint to the court against Mr. Robert Parker and declared that he detaineth his servant, John Kazor, Negro, under the pretense that said Negro was a free man. The court, seriously considering and maturely weighing the premises, do find that the said Mr. Robert Parker most unjustly keepeth the said Negro from Anthony Johnson, his master. It is therefore the judgment of the court and ordered that the said John Kazor Negro forthwith return unto the service of the said Master Anthony Johnson, and that Mr. Robert Parker make payment of all charges in the suit. So John Kazor was brought to America as an indentured servant, and when he worked off his time, Anthony Johnson reneged on the deal, petitioned the court for John Kazor to be his servant for life, and the court granted that petition. And because of that lawsuit, this was the first instance of a judicial determination in the 13 colonies holding that a person who had committed no crime could be held in servitude for life. This case also gave judicial sanction to the right of free Negroes to own slaves of their own race, and it legally classified this man here, Anthony Johnson, as the first legally recognized slaveholder in American history. Seven years later, Virginia made the practice legal for everyone. So, in 1661, Virginia state law said that any free white, meaning whites that were not indentured servants, could own slaves. Free blacks could also own slaves. But not only them, Indians could also own slaves. Wait, did I read that right? Indians could... Say that again? In Virginia, in 1661, Indians, also known as Native Americans, also known as indigenous people of the North American continent, had the right in Virginia to own black people as slaves too. Slavery was a gradual process. Didn't happen overnight. Basically how it worked was over time, people started counting the costs. And they said, if I sponsor people to come over here as an indentured servant, after working so many years, I have to pay them so much money or give them land or give them a cow or whatever the deal was. There were various deals. That added up over time. Whereas I could just snatch somebody from Africa and they can work for me their whole life and I don't have to pay them anything at all. So it was sort of an economic decision. And that's how slavery started really happening. Yeah. So all of that was part one. In part two, I will be discussing why black people own slaves. The answer may surprise you. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my blog. And as always, share all my videos and leave a comment below. I really appreciate it. Looking forward to reading what you have to say. Oh, before I go, I want to give a shout out to Mateo Kirikau. Maybe you haven't heard of him. You probably hadn't heard of him. Check this video out really quick.
Does anybody know this gentleman, Mateo Kirikau? Raise your hand if you know Mateo Kirikau. Mateo Kirikau, and by the way, you're not strange. I've done this presentation all over the country. Nobody has ever heard of Mateo Kirikau. I will explain to you why this is profound. Mateo Kirikau was a Marxist dictator of a country in Africa called Dahomey. In about 1979, 1980, he left that post, but in the early 1990s, he converted to Christianity, and in 1996, he was democratically elected president of the new country. They renamed the country called Benin, Africa. There's Benin, Africa. Now, in 1999, Mateo Kirikau, as president of Benin, Africa, came to the United States of America to do three things. The first thing is to apologize. The second is to seek forgiveness. And the third thing is to seek reconciliation for his country's participation in the African slave trade. Did anybody hear about that? Ladies and gentlemen, this is the head of state of an African nation who came to the United States of America to apologize for his country's export of 3 million of their own people in the African slave trade, and nobody in the United States of America has heard about it.
Mr. Kirikau, thank you.